because there it seems all to be very quick. But in people as they approach death, there is a lot of life review going on, and there's very little doubt that people do revisit many of the scenes of their childhood and of their life. So a reconsideration of your life is certainly carried out by the dying. And sometimes people seem to have a life review where they have to come to terms with everything which went on. Could I just comment on what Richard said?
Yeah.
He said, thanks very much for helping people. And I'd just like to reemphasize that, and that is that dying, as we have been told about it by the dying themselves, isn't that frightening. And people do seem to come to terms with it. And if the accounts of the dying are correct, then we needn't be nearly so frightened. But the other point is that there is this taboo we have in our society of not discussing with each other the wonderful things that happen to us when those close to us do die. So what I'd like to happen is that we get over this taboo and we start discussing it much more amongst ourselves. I think that's very important.
Well, you've helped a lot. So let's go ahead then, too, and take a moment to stress your email address and your willingness to hear from people via the Internet. It's Peter _ and then, as we would pronounce it, Fenwick, but it's Peter _ Fenwick at, and then what's the rest of that, Peter?
btinternet.com.
Okay. And we'll get a link up on the webpage for that to make it easier for people to communicate with you. Zoe is in Vancouver, BC. Yes, you are.
Yes. Ian and Dr. Fenwick, Dr. Peter, you're so right. My grandmother was a trained nurse, and she would sit with the dying if they had no one with them when the metabolism was low in the early hours of the morning. And they would have this moment of lucidity, she said. They would sometimes come out of a coma, and someone would come to get them, most often. So she didn't really have a fear of dying after doing that work. However, she had a fabulous experience, which was actually quite frightening, but it was fabulous. When she had her third baby, she was advanced in age, and all of a sudden she felt her life, her eyes going dark, and she realized she was having a postpartum hemorrhage because she knew what that was. And all of a sudden she was out of her body and floating up, and she knew what the doctors were doing and saying, and the nurses were panicking. And she looked to her side, and she saw Jesus. And he didn't say anything. He was dressed in a medieval crown with a beautiful gold cope. And he smiled a dazzling smile to her and motioned with his hand to come to him. And she wasn't particularly religious or anything like that, but she did say to him, I've just had a baby and I have other children. Please, please let me go back. I know you can do that. And he just looked at her in a very loving way, and he nodded. And at that moment, she felt the pain, and she was right back. And they were all shouting, "Oh, we got her back, we got her back." So she never told anyone about it. And 10 years later, my mother, who was an older child, had brought a book home from school, and she was flipping through it. And there she found a picture that was exactly what she'd seen, and she asked about this picture. And it was apparently the original is hanging in Oxford, and I think Keble College. And when my mother went to read fine art there, she went to go and visit the picture, and it was exactly what my grandmother described. Isn't that lovely? And the other thing was that my grandmother's brothers had been in the First World War, and they both told of the Angel of Mons. Have you heard about that, Dr. Peter?
Tell me.
The Battle of Mons stopped abruptly when a huge angel appeared in the sky. From one, Ian, you'd like this, but, from one end of the horizon to the other, everything, all hostility stopped. Everybody saw it, and it stayed there for the duration of the day until, night, and it was a great comfort to everyone and the dying and all the rest of it. Enormous angel. And it's on somewhere you can look it up. I think the Angel of Mons, and that was somewhere I believe in Belgium, Flanders or somewhere.
Yes, that's correct.
And there's one other thing that sort of troubled me, because my grandmother had always, of course, she died when she was 96 or something like that, and very peaceful and all the rest. But she did say there were one or two deaths that frightened her somewhat. Actually, there were two men that she mentioned who didn't want to go. And I read an account of Voltaire's death, and apparently he had cut an artery in his arm in an accident. And at that moment, this is before, about 10 years before, and he cried out, "Jesus Christ, I'm sorry, I'll retract what I've written about you, just make this bleeding stop." And it stopped. It just stopped. So he was thrilled, but he didn't get around to retracting anything. And then when he died, there were 10 witnesses with him. And the temperature in the room soared, and then it went cold, and they smelled sulfur, and everyone was screaming, and it was just a complete opposite of what one would want. And then he died, and all 10 of those men went back to practicing Christianity after that. So I think they were Catholics. But what do you make of that? I mean, I know there are odd instances, like Rasputin's death was not peaceful.
Right.
Things like that. What do you make of that, Dr. Peter?
Well, there are really a lot of interesting things you said. First of all, the lucidity before people die. That's certainly, we've got lots of accounts of that.
Yes.
The NDE, when she saw Jesus, fits into the prototypical NDE type story.
Yes.
And being allowed to come back is also all part of it.
Yes.
Now, the question of the room temperature in the room changing when Voltaire died, we got a number of accounts of it becoming very cold in the room at the time of death.
Oh, you know about that.
So that isn't necessarily linked to what the people believe or the sort of death they have. It seems to be much more to be actually part of the death process. With some people, those around them sense this drop in temperature at the time of death. But it's really interesting.
Dr. Benedict Groeschel does what you do. I think he's clinical psychiatrist. He's actually a Capuchin in New York. I don't know if he's still alive, but he wrote about some of these things as well. I don't know whether you have contact with him or not, but very interesting as well. Yes.
After this show, it doesn't matter to me whether he's still alive. We can still contact him. So I'm feeling pretty. But there or not, we'll get him. And thank you, Zoe. Very interesting. Again, The Art of Dying is the name of the book, and she brought up the battlefield experience, and then I guess that brings me back to thinking about some of the assorted things that we didn't get to before. So let's take a minute here, in as much as nobody's brought up a pet story yet, to talk about some of the other types of appearances that you were able to catalog.
We had a number of phenomena, again at the time of death, which related to animals. We had a number of dog stories. One person reported that when their mother died, they were at home with their dog, and suddenly, at the moment of death, the dog, it was a King Charles Spaniel, I think, howled and howled and howled and howled in a way it had never howled before. We've got one or two experiences like that. We've got another interesting one, that somebody's relative was dying in Japan, and they were in Australia, and at the moment of death, their dog looked very, very specifically at what they said to them they thought was probably the apparition of the person who was dying in Japan. So this dogs behaving strangely at the time of death is another point. And the next one are birds. We got a lot of accounts of birds sitting on hospice windows throughout the time that people were dying, and lovely bird stories of how birds would, after the death, would come along and spend time with the people who were grieving for their relative. The relatives sometimes interpret this as the spirit of the person coming back, but at any rate, certainly the bird's behavior was different after the death.
Very
Finally, cats. I don't know how many of your listeners will have, or if it was in the American newspapers, heard of Oscar the cat from a hospice in the USA. And Oscar used to go around, lived in the hospice, and he would go and sit on the beds of the dying about 4 days before they died. And so